Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University. I'm Wil Burns, and I'm a visiting professor at Northwestern University's Environmental Policy and Culture program and emeritus co-director of the Institute. In this episode, we focus on a new white paper developed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Carbon Dioxide Removal Task Team. As a bit of context, in November of 2020, the Senior Research Council of the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Office of Ocean and Atmospheric Research charged scientists with devising a draft portfolio of carbon dioxide removal strategic research needs in support of a broader climate strategy that was set forth in executive orders. In response, NOAA formed the Carbon Dioxide Removal Task Team, which is an interdisciplinary group with relevant expertise in climate and carbon issues, coastal and open ocean science, and aquaculture development and ocean conservation. Our webinar today will focus on the key themes in the white paper that's been developed by this team by drawing on the expertise of three members of the team: Dr. Jessica Cross, a research oceanographer with NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory; Dr. Gabby Kitch, an international policy fellow in the NOAA NOUS program; and Dr. Libby Jewett, who is director of NOAA's Ocean Acidification program. And we'll start off with a brief series of interventions to tease out some of the themes of the white paper, and then we'll move to audience Q&A. So with that, NOAA, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Wil. And I'll just give a moment to get the slides queued up. They look great. Jessica, if you could move to the next slide. Thank you again for having us here today. We're excited to talk about the NOAA draft research strategy on CDR. And just so we're all starting from the same place, I know many of us in this virtual room are very familiar with CDR. Carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, is a set of approaches that remove legacy carbon dioxide from the atmosphere for long-term storage on land or in the oceans. And legacy carbon refers to previous emissions of carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere. So this doesn't refer to offsets or abatement or current or future emissions. And because CDR approaches remove legacy carbon dioxide, they directly address the underlying cause of climate change. So scientific assessments find that reducing emissions to meet the Paris targets of 2 degrees or preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming means that nations of the world not only need to shift from a fossil fuel economy and lifestyle to sources that do not emit carbon. So that involves things like solar, nuclear, wind, with any remaining fossil fuel combustion, or any remaining fossil fuel combustion will also need to be paired with carbon capture and storage to achieve carbon neutrality. And then world economies need to go one step further, which involves pulling legacy carbon out of the atmosphere by means of CDR. Without such approaches, carbon dioxide will remain in the atmosphere and continue to impact climate for centuries to come. Jessica, if you could move to the next slide. So one of the main challenges of CDR, especially marine CDR, ocean-based CDR, which I'm sure this audience is well aware of given the policy knowledge in the virtual room, is developing a governance structure or working within the existing structures so that CDR can scale to operation. This includes generating clear guidance for effective and safe permitting procedures and international agreements such as the London Convention and Protocol, and the group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection or GASAMP support CDR research, but without this governance structure, CDR will not be able to scale. And the community is calling also for a code of conduct to guide CDR research in a coherent way, again, to expedite scaling these processes safely. And organizations such as the Aspen Institute and AGU, or the American Geophysical Union, have stepped into this space to develop a code of conduct and guidance. But really the international landscape is a bit fragmented at the current moment. So if we can move to the next slide, Jessica. Meanwhile, in the US, policy is in favor of CDR and has been ramping up. So our current administration views carbon management as a key priority. President Biden has signed 3 executive orders that focus on sweeping decarbonization and the social costs of climate pollution, and has issued a memorandum to federal laboratories to focus on tackling climate change. In addition, new White House reports on innovation to meet 2050 climate goals specifically mention CDR as a game-changing technology. If you can move to the next slide, Jessica. It's clear that Congress is also aware that CDR is going to be a fact in confronting climate change. In fact, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA, highlights that CDR is 1, CDR is necessary to achieve climate goals. 2, CDR supports markets. 3, CDR must be deployed at scale. And 4, such large-scale deployment requires federal support. It is also worth noting that Congress has shown bipartisan energy and support for this effort across the last 2 administrations. Billions of dollars have been appropriated across multiple agencies, but primarily the Department of Energy, in every piece of new legislation since 2020. In some, NOAA has been directed to partner with DOE to implement the work outlined in these bills. In addition, the current administration has also made it a clear priority for science agencies to address CDR research across multiple executive orders and reports, as we mentioned previously. Next slide, please, Jess. Thank you. Akin to international legislation, the permitting pathways and policies around marine CDR in the US also remains a bit opaque. On this slide, we have broken down the existing regulations and laws in aspects that might pertain to marine CDR. So there's legislation around environmental review, namely NEPA, around species protection, coastal and ocean management, ocean dumping, and seabed use laws. We would like to note that in line with NOAA's mission, we will which will be discussed more in the coming slides. NOAA in the past has contributed to implementing many of these to aid in resource management decisions to ensure that we have productive and sustainable fisheries, safe sources of seafood, recovery and conservation of protected resources, and healthy ocean ecosystems. Next slide, please, Jess. And while the legislation around CDR will continue to evolve in the US and abroad, NOAA's mandate that relates to CDR research dates back to legislation passed in 2009. And to discuss this legislation and NOAA's work in more detail, I'll now pass it along to Dr. Libby Jewett, the director of NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program.
Thank you, Gabby. Now I'll move into some additional information. So the Federal Ocean Acidification Research and Monitoring Act of 2009, which actually was just recently reauthorized, established the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, and in there includes language requesting that in addition to other research priorities that NOAA and the other agencies actually that are cited should focus on research around OA mitigation approaches. Any carbon dioxide removal strategy that removes carbon dioxide from the ocean has the potential to mitigate ocean acidification, and some marine CDR methods might even have co-benefits that positively affect local coastal carbon saturation states. So in addition, the language and appropriations, and in addition, the language and appropriations for the National Oceanographic Partnership Program in the recent FY23 congressional budget also highlights marine carbon dioxide removal as a priority research topic. So we've identified a number of tools already developed by NOAA which will benefit carbon dioxide removal efforts. One clear example is the Aquaculture Opportunity Areas program in the Coastal Aquaculture Planning Portal, which we have some graphics about that in a few slides. These tools show scalable interdisciplinary maps that highlight new aquaculture opportunities and will be something that we're bringing to the table. So that's okay. You can stay where you were. Go back. Okay, yeah, so next slide. So cross-agency collaboration is critical for carbon dioxide removal research. The NOAA Ocean Acidification Program has been pursuing these collaborations to expand federal investment in carbon dioxide removal research. In FY22, NOAA's National Oceanographic Partnership Program and the Ocean Acidification Program together co-sponsored an internal request for proposals for marine CDR research with generous funding match from the Department of Energy and the Climate Works Foundation and guiding input from multiple federal partners. And in FY23, that groundwork that we laid has led to an interagency NOP funding opportunity, which was released just a few weeks ago, with support from NOAA, National Science Foundation, several different programs in the Department of Energy, Office of Naval Research, and a private philanthropy, again, Climate Works, together are going to be funding a solicitation focused on marine CDR. And Gabby, you'll, or someone will put a link in the chat so that all of you can see that. So next slide. So we see key connections between carbon dioxide removal efforts and all three of NOAA's core missions: science, service, and stewardship. NOAA is unique in that it considers service and stewardship with science, which is why the agency is dedicated to many climate monitoring, adaptation, and mitigation efforts. In the next slides, I'll walk through examples of how CDR intersects with three elements of NOAA's mission. Next slide. And you can just click all the way through that. One of the best ways to articulate NOAA's science mission in relation to CDR is shown in this graph here to the right. This is a representation of the global carbon budget. It balances the sources of carbon dioxide, such as fossil fuel emissions and land use change, shown in gray and yellow above the x-axis, against the annual sinks and or reservoirs for carbon dioxide. That is where that carbon dioxide goes, namely the land, oceans, and atmosphere, shown below the x-axis. Carbon accounting is one of NOAA's key observing missions. NOAA has extensive experience in monitoring and understanding the natural and anthropogenic processes in the global carbon cycle through its observations, data assimilation, and modeling efforts. The bar graphs on the right compares the amount of CDR necessary to meet our climate goals in 2050 and in 2100 to the size of the current sources and sinks in the 2021 carbon budget. By 2050, CDR may be as large as some of the smaller sinks that NOAA already measures. In 2100, almost as large as the atmospheric growth for CO2. If CDR is scaled as expected, it will become an integral part of the carbon budget. NOAA will not be able to do a good job with our mission to monitor the wedges on the left without also resolving the bars on the right. Inversely, it will be impossible to know how big the bars on the right actually are without also measuring the wedges on the left as the baseline. NOAA's contributions to the global carbon budget will underpin our understanding of the global effectiveness of CDR. NOAA is dedicated to making sure that funding, experimentation, and implementation of CDR is properly monitored, reported, and validated, and more importantly, assessed for its long-term impact and scalability to the global carbon cycle. NOAA's research is dedicated to exploring the downstream impact to natural ecosystems and chemical and physical processes that contribute to yearly carbon dioxide removal. Next slide. NOAA's stewardship and service missions will also underpin sound carbon removal strategies. The recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2 report release notes that a key risk of climate adaptation actions is implementing them poorly. Citing CDR projects in competition with agricultural resources or fisheries, or in ways that compromise other sustainable development goals, could negate any potential benefits. NOAA's mission to manage living marine resources, inform spatial planning, manage space use conflicts, and permit sustainable commercial aquaculture activities will be central to CDR testing and implementation. So next slide. So given all of these mandates and ongoing work, we drafted a research strategy on carbon dioxide removal, which I will now turn over to Dr. Jessica Cross to talk more about.
All right. As Libby said, my name's Dr. Jessica Cross, and I was the lead author of the draft research strategy that put together. And I'm going to take this opportunity this morning to describe to you what's actually in the white paper and hopefully set us up for a bit of discussion at the end of this presentation. You've heard from Libby and Gabby sort of the three motivations that we have for putting this draft research strategy together. First of all, the scientific consensus surrounding the necessity for CDR to meet our climate goals, congressional and administration support for bringing those goals forward, and then clear connections to our existing mandate. So you can read more about the draft research strategy itself at the QR code that you see on this particular screen, but I'll walk you through some of the details now. First, the basics. We split the strategy into 4 parts: the federal motivation for CDR research and the scientific underpinning for that work, which you've essentially already heard summarized by Libby and Gabby this morning. Part 3 highlights NOAA's key assets and equities that can create the kinds of decision support products that our stakeholders are already asking us for. And part 4 is our vision of how that work may progress. In part 2, we already talked about part 1, again, sort of that idea that we want this, we have this strong underpinning of policy support for what we're actually doing, our federal motivation for CDR research. In part 2, we provide a review of CDR techniques in science. So the idea is that across all methods, what we do in this review is briefly outline each of those methods and then highlight some important open questions. So across all methods, one of the things that we highlight is that questions remain about long-term storage, measuring and monitoring CDR efficiency, life cycle analysis, and how we create the products that are necessary to make those calculations, and most especially how to calculate CDR impacts and co-benefits that Libby may have highlighted. In part 3, we highlight 4 key NOAA assets that will be essential to answering some of these open questions. There are really several summary figures in the report that help indicate our key findings, but I'm going to highlight just one of them here. So in this table, those 4 key NOAA assets are listed in the leftmost column, following with some key examples, potential development of those assets, and then finally the impact that the development of those assets could have for the broader CDR community of practice. Briefly, we know that across multiple time and space scales, NOAA's observing systems, modeling resources, ecosystem perspectives, and decision support tools, the 4 rows that you see in this chart, have the potential to track CDR impacts on the Earth system and offer evidence-based perspectives on CDR implementation. We also, in part 3, highlight how important negative emissions research is going to be to the broader federal system. And so as we consider developing products for CDR research at NOAA, we want to emphasize that we're doing that alongside multiple interagency working groups, including the Ocean Acidification Interagency Working Group, the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group, as well as the White House Subcommittee on Ocean Science and Technology. We also participate in a DOE-led interagency CDR task force that was outlined by the Energy Act of 2020 and implemented in the omnibus budget that was passed that year. We also participate in really strong broader DOE and NOAA coordination. Our strongest partnership on CDR certainly comes from the Department of Energy. Right now, we're pursuing broader conversations with ARPA-E, their version of DARPA. They're very interested in developing new sensing technology in order to improve our potential to observe and document actual carbon removed from the atmosphere. We're also setting up collaborations between the national labs. So some of our national labs at NOAA, such as the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, as well as some DOE national labs, such as the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. This is enabling the scientists at both of those agencies to work more broadly together by pursuing these lab-to-lab partnerships. As Libby already said, in part 4, we really outlined the mission and values of NOAA and how we think that these relate to CDR research. Overall, we discuss how these assets could be applied or implemented, moving from initial research to larger scale field trials that will inform continued design and development of the global and coastal observing arrays, modeling systems, ecosystem analysis, and decision support products that underpin our science, service, and stewardship components of NOAA's mission. We're committed to transparent, actionable research that supports collaborative, accountable, sustainable, and fair CDR research. So what's happening now? We've gone through an extensive internal review with the draft research strategy, and this has involved contributions from over 60 NOAA researchers. There were 33 primary authors on the report, and we were guided throughout that entire process of developing our text and conclusions by a 10-person advisory board of leadership at NOAA. Once we had developed our text, we eventually received reviews under the guidance of leadership, again, from 14 different teams across NOAA. And so that included our advisory board, multiple NOAA working groups, each NOAA line office inside our agency. The Science Council reviewed our report 3 times, and we also had a review from the NOAA policy team. Now we're also going through an internal review. We're going through an external review, and this has included 3 stages. So first, an invited written technical review of the entire strategy document. Second, listening sessions for public comment, which we just wrapped up last week. And third, which will come later, revision and re-review by the NOAA Science Council. So you can find an example of what all of that looks like at the website that I shared via the QR code earlier today. So with that, I think that sort of wraps up our quick encapsulation of what was in the report. Thank you to any of those of you who may have participated in the listening sessions last week, as well as to Libby and Gabby for setting me up so strongly to describe what was actually in the report. And at this point, Will, I'll turn it over to you to initiate our discussion. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Libby, Gabby, and Jessica for that excellent overview. And we'll move on to questions. I'm going to exercise the privilege of asking the first one. One of the things that you talked about in the context of ARPA was the critical issue of measurement, reporting, and verification of any sequestration claims that ultimately may occur down the road, either for the voluntary markets or in regulatory markets. Is NOAA in conversations with organizations such as Vera or Puro Earth or others that are engaged in developing ocean-based CDR methodologies at this point, or is that contemplated in the future?
So our closest collaboration comes with DOE, and certainly we're talking to ARPA, Simon Freeman, who is running a new sensor development initiative inside DOE to try and again develop that kind of sensing technology. We've also had basic conversations with NORI and with Vera to talk about their strategies, what they should be sort of considering as good MRV, but I want to emphasize that those are very early conversations about what that might look like. As you well know, Will, MRV is a complex issue. We recently held a workshop at the end of September with much of the marine science and ocean CDR industry community on, important key issues and challenges that are going to result in trying to apply MRV. That workshop was designed specifically to talk about how many open questions there were, and not necessarily to come up with answers. But we hope to be able to do that, again, collaboratively in conjunction with the rest of the community.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, I'm going to turn to to some of the questions that we have. First question is, what are the resources that will be put into the planned research plan?
Libby, I'm going to throw that to you.
Well, the first thing I thought the question was going to be, so for this interagency funding opportunity that we have out, we've collected $30 million towards that effort, which will actually also be partnered with or leveraging another fair amount, probably the same amount from the Department of Energy on the MRV side. So that's one thing. We are in the very early stages of doing CDR work in the agency, and right now we haven't costed this out specifically, and we're hoping to get more authorities from Congress to be able to expand the resources that we have. We are leveraging pretty significant ocean carbon observing effort, but that's not really enough to do CDR specifically. So we're going to be leveraging our expertise in that area, but I would say I'm not sure. Jessica, I don't know if you have a number offhand, but I actually don't know what the total.
Was in a meeting earlier this morning. I suggested that while there are many of us inside the agency that are eager to get involved here, either because of what it can teach us, what CDR can teach us about the Earth system, eager because we're excited to finally be able to work on a solutions-oriented problem rather than documenting, the destructive nature of climate change, which is hard for many of us to do full time, or eager from a conservation perspective to make sure that we don't move so quickly that we destroy, ecosystems that are functioning well despite climate change. For whatever reason you want to get involved, there's a lot of eagerness inside the agency to be able to, again, bring to bear our expertise and our capacity. That being said, we only get to act on that excitement or that eagerness as much as Congress will let us, or as much as Congress instructs us to be able to do so. So as Libby pointed out, there are already existing missions inside the agency that we can leverage for CDR, but just like CDR policy, those efforts weren't designed with CDR in mind. So leveraging kind of handicaps us in our capacity to be able to do a lot of the work that we think that we're capable of. We hope that the draft research strategy opens the door to describing what some of those new developments might be. Again, if I can remind you all of the table that I showed with those 4 key assets and potential development that's included in those 4 key assets. But right now we are doing what we can collaboratively in conjunction with the rest of the community.
Right, thanks.
I'm really proud of this $30 million interagency knob call that we were able to raise. As really impressive effort by Libby. So, yeah,
I agree. Having a dedicated line for that is important. All right, next question. Does the research program presume that CDR will be marketized, or begin by asking how sustainable and fair CDR could be best incentivized and delivered?
I'll take that one again. At NOAA, we very specifically designed the agency to silo policy questions from scientific research questions. So you'll notice in the title of the white paper that research is in the title of the white paper. In part, NOAA sets up these silos to preserve and protect the academic freedom and scientific integrity of scientists that may be working on the research arm of the agency from potential policy conflicts that come on the other side of the agency. So while policy questions like that I think are increasingly important, the research strategy isn't designed to be able to provide those kinds of answers.
Okay. Next question, and this is another logistical question related to MRV. Will NOAA do the monitoring, i.e. deploying the instruments and reporting, or will the startups that are working on CDR also do the monitoring for their process? If the startups do the monitoring, will NOAA verify? How would this all work?
You've touched on one of my favorite topics in all of CDR right now, which is what will this mature system look like? I love talking about this. And the very short version of that answer is, I don't know. We don't know what the mature system is going to look like, but we have the opportunity to collaboratively design that together right now. The market stack as it currently exists includes some MRV companies. A brand new one just got announced, I think yesterday. And so again, sort of private companies are cropping up, not just to provide the CDR interventions themselves, but also to provide that MRV piece. There are private companies that exist solely to help these companies gain permits, private companies that exist solely to help you perform your LCA analysis in consultation, with your business. And so, there are private industry options for essentially every step of this process. How government oversight will be applied is an open question.
Can I interject? I would also, again, I agree with everything Jessica said, which is like, we don't really know how this is all going to shape up, but I do think there is going to be a role for NOAA and the NOAAs in the rest of the world who have scientists that are really good at measuring ocean carbon. I mean, we have the best systems in the world. They're not always the best. I mean, they don't always work exactly how we would like for them to work, but they are the go-to systems for climate quality observations. And I imagine that any system that's set up is going to have references with, sources and scientists like those in NOAA who people trust to do and verify the measurements that they're making. So even if private industry is doing that, there is going to be this verification, I would guess, right, with government.
Yeah, I want to highlight that there are a couple of working groups out there that exist for various CDR techniques that are trying to come up with these structures and cookbooks, essentially, for A, what does good MRV look like, and B, who does that MRV? So, important open questions like, should the ecosystem monitoring be considered under an MRV portfolio? Or is that in addition to MRV, which should only focus on the biogeochemistry? But can it, given that some of these methods rely on photosynthesis and life and perturbations through the ecosystem? Important open questions that will very likely vary for each CDR method. So I know there's one out there for seaweed already. I know that there's an MRV effort for ocean alkalinity enhancement that's being championed in Europe. And I think that there are a couple of other methods that also have working groups trying to design MRV cookbooks and MRV structures already. So again, I think this will be a whole of community collaborative effort.
Right, but we had a question in there that was more pointed in this context, which is, do you think ultimately government will have to fulfill the role of MRV? And provide some oversight of the claims that the private companies in this ecosystem may be pursuing.
Yeah, are you pointing at me? Again, we don't know, but again, I feel strongly that there will be a role in exactly the way you described it, Will, that there will be it will necessarily require that there be a trusted entity, which is likely government, and in our case, likely NOAA, that will be doing the verification of the claims. But it doesn't mean that we're doing all the MRV, but that there's some some line of sight to a group that has authority in that space and has expertise. And so hopefully that answers your question.
All right, thanks for that. Let's see. Next question, will the projects that are funded under the $30 million call and more broadly the research agenda that you outlined here be aligned with the calls for research outlined in the NASEM Ocean CDR report from last year?
Gabby, that's you.
Yeah.
What did you
sorry. My dog is ringing her Christmas bells, so celebrating the holiday coming up. She's being very festive too. So yeah, if you visit the link that I dropped in the chat, you'll see on pages 6 and 7 of the full funding opportunity. There's 33 pages, so some light holiday reading for you all if you're interested in putting forth an application. You'll see that there's a number of different priorities. There are 7 total priorities. One of those priorities, I believe it's 6, does mention furthering research on the strategies outlined in the NASEM report. So if you're interested in exactly the proposals we're interested in receiving for the call, definitely visit the priorities on page 6 and 7.
All right, thank you. Next question. Other than NOPP opportunities, is NOAA planning any partnerships with the academic research community in this context?
So NOAA's participating really broadly in the community is what I would suggest. And so organizations like the North American Carbon Program and the Ocean Carbon Biogeochemistry Program, 2 carbon researcher communities of practice. Certainly a lot of our research staff as well as our program staff participate really extensively, again, in those communities of practice, in those networks that involve so many collaborations with our academic colleagues. And we're really working hard to make sure that any planning that we do is cross-planned alongside major academic institution initiatives or alongside initiatives from other government agencies. Our goal is, again, to make this as efficient as possible. We don't want to duplicate effort. And we want everybody to be on the same page as much as possible. And so we are participating in those communities of practice.
All right, thank you. Next question is, you outlined what the need is going to be for in terms of ocean and more broadly CDR in the future. Does NOAA as yet have any sense of what the potential is in the context of ocean CDR?
Can you give me units on that potential? Are you talking funding or are you talking gigatons of removal?
I hate to speak for the questioner, but I suspect, given the context, they're talking about the potential sequestration.
So there is a table in the report that summarizes the current at the time of writing. New publications get released every day, and I already know that I want to make updates to that table itself. But there is a table that summarizes sort of the potential range in gigatons of removal that we think each of these methods are capable of. In response to that question, what I would emphasize is that, as is outlined in the IPCC's recent 6th assessment report, even if we scaled all of the terrestrial CDR methods, DAC, BACS, soil carbon, et cetera. Even if we afforestation and reforestation, if we were to use all of the land area necessary to implement those strategies to the degree that they would provide 100% of our CDR needs, they would be in direct competition with other sustainable development goals. There's just not enough territory to be able to gain 100% of what we need from the terrestrial system, which means that the ocean and coastal ecosystems, or the ocean and coastal systems, are going to have to backfill what we can't get from land. This is not unreasonable. The ocean is a dominant sink and controller of the ocean or the global carbon system, not just the ocean carbon system, but the global carbon system. It moves a lot of carbon around already. So certainly the capacity for CDR methods that really emphasize and focus on the ocean's natural capacity to move carbon, whether it's moving it through phytoplankton and life and biology, or whether it's moving it through the inorganic system, the ocean has that capacity. The question is whether or not we'll be able to scale that capacity over the time frame that we actually need it. So these are commonly referred to as nature-based solutions. Can we accelerate, these nature-based processes enough such that they provide a human benefit? Early research says theoretically possible. The implementation of it is what is still in the testing phases, and what the consequences of that implementation will be, I would also argue, are not well understood yet.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Under stewardship, you listed, quote, fair CDR research. Can you expand on what the report says about notions of fairness and equity?
So there's a section in the report that focuses on NOAA's social science missions. And those missions are really focused on community input and working directly, on the ground with communities. A great example of that work is actually a part of Libby's program, the coastal acidification networks, that really try to involve local communities in the research that we're doing, and make sure that any of the research that we're doing correspondingly also supports community priorities. I've been a huge beneficiary of that program myself as a researcher, where working in Alaska, I've been able to work directly with Alaskan communities to ask, how do you make decisions? What information do you need to make those decisions? Can I create that information? Let's do it. A lot of times, I think we shut down as researchers because the way that human communities make decisions seems so far removed from the work that we're actually able to do. A community member might say, well, I need a scalable interdisciplinary map of ocean acidification risk. And as somebody who studies CO2 flux, you're like, nah, I can't do that. But if we work together alongside the rest of the community to say, okay, well, what are the steps between studying ocean CO2 flux and creating these scalable interdisciplinary maps? Let's build the infrastructure, the lattice work that's necessary to move this data product towards this decision support mechanism. And that, has really helped me focus my research program, and in my opinion is a really strong component of the ocean acidification program. Libby, I don't know if you want to offer any more perspectives on what that means to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would reiterate the Biden administration commitment to ensuring that any of our climate response activities like this benefit the disadvantaged and underrepresented communities in much greater ways than we have done in the past. And this is difficult to do. I mean, we really need to engage, and we need to do it early as this effort is ramping up. But I'm seeing that. I feel like so at least in conversations with some of the companies that are considering, deploying CDR strategies, that they're already trying to have those conversations with communities in ways that maybe was not true in the past. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, let me drill down a little bit on that. I think everybody would agree to some degree that BOEM kind of made a hash of this process when it came to offshore wind development and fisheries communities, and kind of the conflicts and trade-offs that would be associated with development of offshore wind resources. Is there a formal process in place to educate the stakeholders about the potential trade-offs that might occur between, for example, large-scale macroalgae development and fisheries, and to figure out how to reconcile those interests or acknowledge those trade-offs and compensate for them, or is it just more broadly an educational effort at this point?
Did you want to go wade into that, Jessica?
You did the offshore wind thing for a little while. I thought I'd let you respond to that, and then I can talk a little bit.
Well, I mean, I guess well, I think your question is spot on. You know, there are a lot of conflicting uses of the ocean, and there are a lot of important, you know, livelihoods that are derived from the ocean that we need to be keeping in mind as we move forward. And I think it's specifically about the offshore wind efforts as a, you know, maybe a way to or not to organize our approaches. And I do think we need to make sure that we're looking for synergies where it's possible. So for instance, could there be deployment of MCDR in wind energy areas where perhaps, you know, fishermen are already kind of deciding that they're not going to fish there, so that we're not expanding that beyond and outside those areas and creating even more conflict. I think we have to be thinking at a lot of different scales. And that I would also say, because MCDR is so like relatively new effort, that it hasn't really scaled up to the point where we have figured out how those processes are going to run. But I do think we have to, you know, we have to learn from how other efforts are running and you know, take advantage of the lessons learned there in order to move forward smartly and with all the voices at the table at the same time.
Yeah, my favorite example to throw out there is you can't fish for crab in a kelp farm.
Mm-hmm.
So even though Alaskans are very interested both in fishing for crab and in kelp farming as a way to compensate for recent losses and crashes in the crab industry, you can't, like in some places, you just can't do both. So how do you set up a permitting structure? How do you, you know, again, sort of try to the best extent possible to resolve some of these space use conflicts? I think these are important open questions, and I don't think those structures exist yet with CDR, you know, at the forefront or CDR in mind for what they might look like. Aquaculture is a little different. You know, the Aquaculture Opportunity Areas program is working really hard to incorporate, you know, again, multiple spatial layers that sort of identify some of these space use conflicts as a way of trying to mitigate them. And as Libby said, I think we can learn from those structures that already exist, but I'm not aware of one that's already prevalent that has CDR at the forefront.
Yeah, I think that's a good point on the aquaculture program, because I'm just constantly thinking about what models we might draw on in this context, right? Because in the early stages, right, it's not going to matter much, but when the rubber really meets the road and we're looking at either large scale field research or deployment, right, it's going to matter a lot, right? And
absolutely. There are other policies that we can look to in terms of wastewater treatment and desalination facilities. I know that there are CDR methods that are relying on the essentially regulations on the effluent from desalination plants and wastewater treatment plants that can accommodate some CDR within those boundaries of, you know, what is permissible concentrations of alkalinity, or you know, what are permissible pH ranges in effluent. You may be able to get away with doing some CDR inside those existing regulations, but again, they weren't written with CDR in mind. And the aquaculture program and wastewater and desalination treatment are all very coastal examples, right? There are some CDR methods that are going to be most successful, perhaps, in the open ocean. And as as Gabby pointed out, international regulations that are fragmented. How do you apply all of those fragmented pieces into one particular field trial? At the beginning, I think it's going to be ad hoc. You're going to, come up with a field trial and get all of the different sorts of permits that you think you're going to need. Mistakes are going to be made along the way. And maybe those initial efforts will teach us about what happens. But I also want to take this opportunity to denote that NOAA's primary equities in this space really focus on measuring the impact of CDR interventions on the Earth system. NOAA, at least not right now, it's not really within our mandate to actually be conducting these interventions ourselves. So we're going to be following with interest as others do develop that work.
Yeah, let me drill down a little bit on that. In that context, when we're looking at the division of responsibility in the federal government in this context, and we start to talk about the open oceans, for example, who in the federal government is responsible for looking at how we implement our international treaty obligations, for example, if we move to the open oceans? Is that primarily EPA?
Gabby?
Yeah, I mean, that's my understanding. That EPA has, I'm not sure what the term is, but sort of oversight, I guess, of the London dumping protocol under the law of the sea. And I think that's going to be the place where these conversations are being had for international effort, international deployments, international water. So that would be anything beyond most countries 200 miles off the shore, right? So you go past 200 miles, then we're getting into international waters. For also open ocean, but in our own waters, NOAA has oversight from like 3 miles out to 200 miles, but EPA, because their focus is again on the dumping protocols, and because water moves, even if it, whatever happens in our waters, chances are it's going to move out and down into international waters. Having the EPA involved in that is going to be imperative and also recognized already. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of where I see those conversations happening. There could be other parts of the UN system that has some oversight, the Convention on Biological Diversity, for instance, maybe.
Law of the Sea Convention,
yeah, exactly. I would imagine there are going to be some, I would like to see some conversations happening between countries through the Law of the Sea convenings sooner rather than later. Yeah.
Doesn't help, of course, that we're not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, but there you go. Next question. What is the potential to co-locate marine CDR on offshore wind turbines?
Well, Jessica, you may have I just wanted to say I learned something at one of the workshops actually that Jessica convened that was focused on marine CDR back in September, that when platforms, fixed platforms, offshore wind platforms are being put in, and this may be actually more in Europe than here because we don't have very many actually in the water yet, that when they put them in, they actually use olivine sand as they put it down in some way when they're putting the platforms in. And it just turns out that olivine sand is one of the elixirs that we're looking to as a buffering substance that's relevant to marine CDR. So we may actually be doing it already, but not having entirely thought that through. But But I feel like there is an opportunity here for co-location, especially because there's energy also being generated, and there is likely in some of these approaches going to be need for energy in the deployment of whatever the technology is. But yeah, I think we would be missing an opportunity if we don't co-locate. But Jeff.
Yeah, strategies for combining marine renewable energy resources with CDR is actually one of the priorities in the NOFO. Gabby, did you want to say anything about that?
No, I think just again, looking at pages 6 and 7, you can see more about those different priorities outlined.
That priority comes specifically from the Department of Energy's Water Power Technologies Office. They're very interested in strategies for co-location and how we can use marine renewable energy resources for to power, some of these high energy CDR installations, like direct ocean capture, for example. Requires a lot of energy. Maybe we can get that energy renewably. That's the only way the life cycle analysis actually works out to be net negative, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's what the Canadians have been telling us too. So it's interesting. So I don't want to be morbid, but it's 2022, and in 2024, I heard we're going to have an election for that. And potential change of administrations. Do you get a sense that there is a sufficient bipartisan support for marine CDR and CDR in general, that the program that you're outlining is going to have legs should we see a Trump administration, a DeSantis administration, or so forth, a change in parties, right? Because President Biden's obviously very enthusiastic about these things. A new administration may not be. Is this something that's baked in at this point?
Baked in, I think, is generous. Anytime you're trying to scale, new efforts, there's always uncertainty associated with that. I mean, just ask the budget committee that's trying to get a budget passed right now, right? New piece of anything is challenging. I will say that I do think that this is a bipartisan issue. CDR, especially at the Department of Energy, has been in every major piece of legislation across the last 2 administrations. A Trump administration and a Biden administration. In my sort of personal experience, if you come from a more conservative background, you like CDR as a technical solution to climate change because it doesn't ask people to change their behavior. It's technocratic. People, love the opportunity that we can build ourselves out of a hole, right? Creates jobs, supports markets, like jobs and dollars, right? If you come from a more liberal background, that the science suggests that we need an all of the above strategy for combating climate change. Not only are we going to need to reduce emissions, but at this point, we can't just reduce emissions alone. The IPCC acknowledges that CDR is going to be a necessary and major component of any climate strategy that meets, our goals of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius with limited overshoot. I mean, it's a fact at this point. So I don't hear anyone arguing that CDR is a bad idea or won't be a part of a comprehensive climate solution. That being said, implementing a comprehensive climate solution is elusive. So whether or not we can implement these strategies at the speed and scale that we know is necessary is always the open political question that, again, as a scientist, or as all scientists on the line today, we're policy agnostic. So the best that we can do is describe the risks of various courses of action, including inaction, and we have to let decision makers take it from there.
All right, that seems like a good coda. We have reached the top of the hour, so I'd like to thank Gabby, Libby, and Jessica for providing us with a good overview of what NOAA is doing in this context. I'd like to thank our participants as always for some excellent questions. Happy holidays to everyone. I hope you'll join us at the beginning of next year for future episodes of Scrubbing the Skies. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye now.